Hey guys, this is Garrett McLaughlin and I hope you're having a great day. Today I want to talk about some strategies to help improve function at the hips. So when I say improve function at the hips, I mean, do we have the necessary flexibility, mobility, activation, and strength at the joint to be a successful runner? So if you think of the running movement, the movement pattern itself, especially at the hip joint, the hip is big for propulsion, again, driving ourselves and pushing off the ground. So we need a degree of extension. When that's the case, we need to make sure we have not just strength through the glutes, strength and endurance, but flexibility through the front of this hip. So any tightness in the hip flexors will limit our extension, which could cause us either reduced performance or us to compensate and use other areas of the body to a greater extent to help propel the body, especially as you get up to higher mileage. So offsetting or working on that sooner rather than later is important. The first thing we can work on is the half kneeling hip flexor stretch. So on this, I always see a lot of people doing this incorrectly, because if you look at my back foot, they tend to just let the back leg hang out and just aimlessly lunge forward. If you ever see someone lunging into this position, I would stop them right away, because here we're feeling still the front of the hip, but we're actually getting the joint capsule and not the muscles, not the psoas, not the iliacus, not these hip flexor muscles. What you want to do just to adjust that is to dig your back toe into the ground. Okay, so I'm driving my back leg into the ground and engaging my glute. Just by doing that, I'm almost locking that hip joint in the socket. I'm staying up tall. I'm doing a small lunge forward. So by engaging the glute and driving back, I barely have to lunge and I'm already feeling a hip flexor stretch. So staying up nice and tall. If you need a little bit more of a stretch, instead of lunging, again, losing that position, going back into old habits, stay tall, lift up so my right leg is down. My right arm can come up, I can turn, and I can even tilt. Because if you think of, from an anatomy standpoint, one of these hip flexor muscles, the psoas, comes from the spine and goes all the way down to the hip. So if we change our spine position and we tilt away from the leg that's being stretched, automatically you'll feel a big pull all the way up deep within the belly, because you'll most likely be getting that psoas muscle. So that's how to increase flexibility there through the hip. The next strategy is activation. So we know we worked on flexibility here, we're more loose, we can get into extension. That's half the battle. Now training these muscles through the glutes to be able to extend the hip and to be able to consciously control them when we want to is the next step. So from an activation standpoint, just building that neuromuscular activation is important, because a lot of times people work on strength without being able to actually fire the correct muscles when they strengthen. That leads to compensation. So if you're laying on your side and you're lifting up and back, this exercise is very simple. We're just gonna find a position and hold where we feel like we're firing that posterior glute med. Again, right in the back of the hip. This muscle is important to extend, but also to stabilize the limb. Every step you take, does the knee collapse in, or do you have good alignment? This muscle is really big in controlling the position of the leg. So I'm gonna lift up, I'm gonna hold that position for 30 to 60 seconds. I wanna be able to do this for 60 seconds before I move on, okay? So if I lose it, I'm just gonna relax down, take a breath, and then come back up. But building activation from side to side is important. And if you notice one side is harder than the other, spend time on that more difficult, more challenging side, because we want to balance out. You'll notice, and I think a lot of you will notice, that one side will be more challenging than the other. So be patient, spend more time on that challenging side, and really balance the chain. After that, going into hip extension is important, and we can do that with just with the hip lift. Again, very simple exercise. Trying to make sure at all times we're not extending through the spine. This is only a hip dominant exercise. So if I dig my heels in or keep the weight towards the back of my shoes here, I'm gonna drive, really engage my glutes and lift up. 1, 2, 3, and lower. 1, 2, 3, and lower. If you notice that you feel the hamstrings or the lower back a lot, that means that you're compensating. You're not firing in the glutes the way you should be. So go back to the activation exercise, make sure that's perfect first, and then from here, consciously contract, squeeze glutes, and then lift. So doing 10 to 20 repetitions and several sets of that is important, because that will build the strength and the endurance in the hips to help teach us how to extend, because that's the propulsion motion that we want to be successful when we're running. After that, being upright and working on hip extension is the last step, because we don't want to just work on all ground-based exercises. We want to teach the body how to extend when we're upright, because that is what carries over to running. So the hip hinge is very important, because we're teaching ourselves how to move around the hips without the lower back moving. So we don't want to cause, a lot of people are going into extension instead of glute or hip extension. So what we're going to do here is small bend in the knees. I'm going to try to keep my back flat and let my hips lower me down. Okay, so what I like to do with this one is actually place my hands right into the crease of the hips, and then I'm going to go and try to squeeze my hands between my belly and my thighs, because that's how I know if I'm moving right around the hip joint and not the lumbar spine. You'll notice when you're first trying this motion, it's really easy to come into flexion and then to stand back up with extension. That's something I think we do too commonly, is we overuse the back for a lot of these motions when it should be the hip. And if we're using the hip and keeping the back nice and flat, we're really reducing a lot of stress and force through that lumbar spine, which is very good from a injury prevention standpoint on the low back moving forward. So small bend of the knees, hinge through the hips. As I get down to the bottom, I feel a little lengthening through the hamstring. Very good for flexibility. I'm going to drive the hips forward, and I'm going to stand up. So that's where I'm working on that hip extension. Even though my feet are on the ground, it still carries over into that push-off motion that you need for running. Once you get good at that, you can add dumbbells, a barbell, anything for resistance, and go through that same exact motion. Hinge through the hips, drive, glutes forward. So I'm contracting my glutes as I drive forward. So everything I used up until this point, the hip flexor stretching, the activation exercise, the hip lift, really sets the stage to be upright and perform that hip extension movement. So that's it, guys. Those are several strategies to help you improve hip function. Again, work on the basics, really master those. You should be able to do those pretty consistently and on demand. So if you have trouble with any of those steps, take time, take 2 to 3 weeks and really work on those consistently. But those will help you really set the stage for better performance moving forward with your running.